I've spent 20 years studying cold cases, but few things disturb me anymore. You look at enough missing person reports, you stop expecting answers. Still, that changed in February 2019 when I found the 6-minute gap. It started with a call from a retired security contractor named Hank Walters. He sounded nervous, his voice uneven, like someone who'd convinced himself nobody would believe him. "I've got footage that's not supposed to exist," he said. "People go missing all the time, but not like this. They shouldn't be able to vanish between two cameras pointed at the same hallway." I almost hung up. Every eccentric with a theory about time slips or ghosts somehow finds me. But Hank emailed the files. I opened them out of habit and then watched something that's made me question everything I knew about reality. The footage showed part of the Jefferson Textile Complex, an abandoned factory in Ohio that went bankrupt in the late 90s. Two cameras, both old analog models, were pointed at opposite ends of a corridor leading to a sealed elevator shaft. The building had been closed for years, but a group of urban explorers had broken in. You could see them 5 people, all in hoodies, walking toward the elevator. Camera A showed them entering the corridor at 2:06 a.m. Camera B, facing the same passage from the opposite end, should have shown them coming through less than 10 seconds later. But they never appeared. For exactly 6 minutes, the corridor on Camera B stayed empty. No static, no interference, just nothing. And then, suddenly, at 2:12 a.m., the group reappeared, running screaming. One of them was missing. When police were called, they didn't bother much. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of crime. The missing explorer Ethan Lewis, 27, had likely gotten lost or fallen through rotten flooring, according to the report. But here's the detail the authorities ignored. Between those 6 missing minutes, 2 stationary cameras recording simultaneously had entirely different timelines. When I scrubbed through the footage frame by frame, something even stranger appeared. At one frame, time-stamped 2:09, there was a flicker of distorted light on the left wall. It wasn't from any flashlight. It pulsed once, like a breath. The explorers couldn't have missed it unless they were somewhere else entirely during those missing 6 minutes. I called Hank that night. He said he'd installed those cameras back when the factory was still operational. "You're telling me the same damn thing happened back in '98, he mumbled. "We called it the blink. Some guy went missing during a maintenance check. We replaced the system the next month." But the footage from that night was identical. He emailed me that clip too. I watched as a maintenance worker, identified as Tom Hargrove, walked into the same corridor. He turned a corner, and then he was gone. Same 6-minute gap. No audio disruption. No recording error. And when the camera resumed showing motion, you could see a fresh mark on the concrete wall like scorch residue. It was still visible in the 2019 video, 20 years later. That's when I decided to go there myself. The Jefferson complex was shut tight, covered in rust and graffiti. The main gate was welded, but side access through the old loading dock was manageable. I entered alone just past midnight with a GoPro on my chest and a flashlight stronger than most car headlights. The corridor looked exactly like in the footage. Peeling green paint, thick dust, and silence so deep that even my breathing sounded intrusive. That's when I noticed the faint hum-like electric current from behind the elevator doors. They were sealed. No working power. Yet the hum was unmistakable. As I stepped closer, my flashlight flickered once. I checked the battery full. The air felt charged, as though static gathered around me. And then I saw the scorch mark Hank mentioned. Charred concrete near the hinge, perfectly circular, like something had burned reality itself. That's when I heard footsteps echoing down the corridor. But when I turned, no one was there. The footsteps were wrong, not the hollow rhythm of boots on concrete, but a staggered syncopation like 2 people walking half a beat apart and landing on the same floor at different times. A sound tugged at my ears like a migraine starting behind the eyes, and for a second I felt seasick standing still. Then the corridor exhaled, air moving though nothing else did, and the hum inside the sealed elevator thickened, as if whatever was sleeping down there rolled and faced me. Ethan? The name left my mouth before my brain had time to veto it. I don't talk to missing people at scenes. You don't speak into empty rooms unless you want the room to speak back. The GoPro timer ticked in blue digits on my chest rig. 12:14 a.m. I panned my light along the corridor, slow as a surveyor, not a ghost hunter. Dust motes hung like suspended rain. My beam caught the scorch ring perfect, as a carpenter's compass had traced it, and the rim wasn't black so much as absence, an oily oval that drank light without shining back. There's an instinct old cops have. Locate all exits, then put your back to the least bad one. My least bad exit was behind me, down past a bend where the brickwork sagged like a slouching shoulder. Ahead, the elevator doors were Cold War relics, ribbed steel and baked paint, padlocked twice in 2 different decades. Between me and them, the corridor where time had failed 2 cameras in the same direction. I lifted my phone and snapped to still. In the frame, it looked ordinary until I zoomed in. The dust over the scorch ring blurred into a faint radial pattern, like ripples frozen in flour after a wind. Except there was no wind here. Hank had said, the blink. The way he said it told me it wasn't a nickname. It was an obituary. He'd sent me a second file I hadn't opened yet, an audio note from 1998, the night Tom Hargrove vanished. I thumbed it open and hit play. A hiss, the clack of an analog recorder button, then a man's steady voice counting steps. 10, 11, 12. A pause. Doors warm. Metal bangs. Tom? You there? Then nothing but that electric hum and further off someone whistling tunelessly. A note that missed its own center and kept missing. The audio timestamp stuttered twice, jumped ahead exactly 6 minutes, then resumed with a shout that clipped into white noise. The recorder stopped on its own. Batteries don't decide to protect you, but that day it sounded like they tried. My light flickered again. 3 pulses, even. A signal or a warning, couldn't tell. I edged closer to the elevator and laid my palm near, not on, the seam. Cold leaked through the air like freon, bleeding from a cracked line. Behind the metal, something made a small, bureaucratic sound like papers being shuffled in a quiet office. It's strange what the mind does with fear. It looks for metaphors that make no sense and clings to them anyway. Papers, files, someone rearranging a case you hadn't opened yet. Okay, I said, to myself or the door. Hard to say. Show me the trick. I set the GoPro to mark time overlay and rolled. I also placed a cheap keychain camera on the floor, aimed at camera A's vantage point, the way the explorers had come in. Red LED steady. Then I did the stupidest brave thing I've done in years. I stepped so the scorch ring was directly between my feet and waited 1 full minute without moving. The hum swelled. The hairs on my forearms rose like iron filings around a magnet. And then, without any drama at all, the air felt thinner, like a pressure cabin losing a single sigh. The corridor didn't change, but I did. My ears popped softly. The LED on the keychain cam stuttered and held. My watch stayed obedient. Yet somewhere in the quiet, a clock I couldn't hear slipped a tooth. I took 1 step forward. Instantly, the tunneled perspective of the hallway flexed. I don't have a better word. The geometry kept its right angles, kept its parallel lines, but depth behaved like it had been stretched and recoiled, as if the corridor had remembered being longer and forgot how to be that again. My vision doubled, and then refused to admit it had. That was when the man appeared at the far end, exactly where camera B would have stared. He wasn't there, and then he was as if a cut had been made with dull scissors and spliced in. He wore a maintenance jacket, faded blue, with a stitched name oval. Tom. He walked toward me, eyes forward, jaw clenched, as if running late to a place he hated. I raised a hand. Tom. He kept walking, not a glance, the way people pass each other on escalators in opposite moral worlds. When he crossed into the span of my flashlight, his figure dissolved into a smear of light and dust, and then reassembled 2 steps past me, still walking, still not seeing me, until he wasn't there again. My legs didn't move, but I swear my bones took a step back inside my skin. I've interviewed witnesses who swore they'd seen echoes or plays of people repeating the last quick minute of their lives, like a house keeps a record no one authorized. Most stories carry the fingerprints of grief or guilt. This didn't. Tom wasn't repeating. He was commuting through a schedule I didn't belong to. He wasn't dead in the way a ghost is dead. He was elsewhere in the way a train is elsewhere when it tunnels under a field you're standing in. The keychain cam chirped. Its LED, steady red, blinked once every 6 seconds now. The GoPro timestamp drifted by 1/10 of a second compared to my watch. I checked both, then checked again, and decided to pretend neither mattered until I was out. I backed off the scorch ring, and the air grew heavier, more honest. The hum thinned to a line, the flavor of the room returning to rust and mold, and the animal scent of old insulation. On the way out, at the bend in the corridor, I saw something I missed coming in. A smear of chalk on the wall at knee height. Not graffiti markings like a carpenter's shorthand. Triangle, circle, triangle, then a slashed 6. Chalk had run under a drip and left a pale tear down the cinder block. I took a photo, then rubbed 2 fingers across the chalk. It felt greasy, not like school chalk, but like talc that had been carried in an oily palm. When I sniffed my fingers, an old habit that embarrasses me, there was a faint scent of machine shops and wintergreen. Some maintenance guys used to tuck menthol behind their gums to stay awake. I left the way I came. The night felt unseasonably warm outside the factory, as if the building leaked cold into the neighborhood. A freight train sounded in the distance. 3 notes, the second longer, and I realized my brain had been starving for normal noises. At my car, I locked the doors, not because locks stop physics, but because rituals keep people sane. I copied the footage to 2 drives before I even started the engine. Then I drove to Hank's. He lived in a ranch house the color of dishwater, a place that would look empty even when fully occupied. He answered still wearing the same shirt from our last meeting, or the same kind of shirt, which for Hank was identical to the same shirt. He watched my face while I set the drives on his table. "You saw it," he said, no rise at the end to make it a question. I nodded. "Tom?" I nodded again. Hank blew air out his nose, sat, and didn't touch the drives like they might bruise. Back then, after Tom, we replaced every run. New cameras, new time server, new everything. Never told corporate the truth. They would have fired us for telling them the truth. We wrote interference from welding operations. There was no welding. "What is it?" I asked. He rubbed his jaw where stubble had decided to become beard and failed. Couple of us said it was the elevator shaft. Something wrong with the counterweight room. Maybe a magnetic field. Maybe some weird eddy. Someone said time slip, and I told him to shut up. But at night, when I couldn't sleep, I thought about the way the cameras skipped in sync with the generator load. Like the building breathed shallow when the generator exhaled. He looked up at me. "I think it's not the building. I think it's us that skip." I didn't argue. Not because I agreed, but because the word skip felt accurate in a way facts sometimes aren't. "There's another thing," Hank said. Ethan's friends, the ones on the 2019 footage, they kept a group chat. One of them messaged me after the police stopped caring. She said that in the 6 minutes they don't appear on camera B, they kept walking. To them, it wasn't 6. It was maybe half a minute, tops. She said the hallway stretched and then snapped back. And the guy at the back, Ethan, was suddenly 15 feet behind him, calling like his voice got stuck in glue. Hank swallowed. She said she heard whistling behind the door. The tuneless kind? I asked. He went pale. You heard it too? I nodded. We sat in the sticky quiet that kitchens trap after midnight. The refrigerator cycled on, a domestic thunder. Somewhere down the block, a dog tried out 3 tentative barks and lost interest. I want to go back, I said, and Hank closed his eyes like a tired parent, but not with just cameras. If it's a skip, we need reference points, analog and digital. A tuned watch, a metronome, a Faraday pouch to isolate clocks. And we need someone at the other end of the corridor. We'll walk toward each other and count. If we lose each other between 2 angles again, we'll have timestamps on both ends. If the corridor flexes, I want to see where it bends. Hank shook his head because he was going to say yes and needed to warm up to the idea of disliking himself for it. There's one more thing you should know, he said. Back in '98, the week after Tom, the night janitor, quit, he told me he found a note on the break room bulletin board pinned with a coffee stirrer. It said, "We owe 6 minutes every Friday. Pay on time." He thought it was a joke. Then he realized no one had been in that break room for 2 days. Hank reached into a drawer, pulled out a Ziploc bag, and slid it across. Inside, a yellowing scrap of paper, letters pressed with a heavy hand, a circle drawn at the bottom edge like a punch ticket. I kept it, he said, because I'm not sure who it was written to. I stared at the circle. It wasn't inked. It was rubbed in, a greasy ring that didn't bleed through. My fingertip itched where the chalk had smeared earlier, and in that small itch, I felt certain of something I couldn't justify to anyone sober. Friday was tomorrow, and whatever kept accounts in that shaft was expecting payment. Hank didn't sleep the next day. He called at noon to ask if I was still serious, then again at 5 to ask if we should bring a third person, then at 7 to tell me he'd asked 2 old coworkers, and both said they'd lost time in that hallway back in the day, but never told anyone because you don't clock a deficit you can't invoice. By 10 p.m., he texted one word: tonight. I packed like a man going to sea. 2 synchronized digital watches set to NTP earlier that evening. 1 analog field watch. A wind-up metronome marked at 60. 2 disposable keychain cams. A high-speed audio recorder with timestamp overlay. A Faraday pouch from one of the digitals. Chalk my own, the clean classroom kind. And a small contractor's level, because something in my gut said we might need to know where gravity got lazy. We parked 2 blocks away to avoid making the building think about us. Superstition, sure, but superstition is a toolkit when math won't pick up the phone. The Jefferson complex hunched against the sky like a ship run aground and left to rust. The air on the property line went a degree colder. Inside, our lights found the familiar tunnel of the corridor. Paint curled from the cinder block like sunburn. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped with courtroom patience. We set up quietly. I taped 1 keychain cam at the vantage where camera A would have seen us, and placed the second at the far end, the camera B angle. Hank ran a spool of Bright Mason's line between them down the center of the hallway, our breadcrumb spine. I chalked marks at 6-foot intervals and wrote our initials H and M at either end. The metronome went at the midpoint on a folding stool, ticking its little heart out. Analog field watch on my left wrist, digital on the right. Hank mirrored me, but kept his second digital dead in the Faraday pouch for a control. On your count, he said. Mark 0, I answered, and pressed record on all devices. I snapped my fingers once and said 0, aloud so the audio could marry the video later. We started walking toward each other from opposite ends, 1 beat per step, a slow procession down a hospital corridor that no one cleans anymore. Tick, step, tick, step. At 24 feet apart, the hair on my forearms rose same static tide as before. At 18, the corridor's vanishing point did that impossible flex, and then pretended it hadn't. At 12, a taste of copper rose in my mouth like I'd bitten my tongue. My analog second hand stayed true. My right hand digital hesitated 1/10 and caught up, a drunk who realized he'd stepped off a curb and faked a recovery. 9 feet. Whistling started behind the elevator doors off key, the same tune that refuses to remember itself. Hank heard it too. He flinched without losing the beat. "Keep walking," he said, but his voice came from half a step to my left, like a radio with the balance knob nudged wrong. 6 feet. The mason's line between us bowed no draft in that corridor, but the line drew a shallow curve toward the scorch ring. Physics should object, but physics didn't sign the visitor log tonight. The metronome kept ticking dead center, steady as a priest. 3 feet. We reached out our hands to touch and missed by an inch, then by 2, and our palms slid through each other, like our skin had been mapped onto 2 slightly different versions of the room. I didn't feel cold. I didn't feel heat. I felt a conceptual error, the way a word you've said too many times stops being a word and becomes only noise. Hank's mouth moved. The sound reached me a beat later and wrong, like it had bounced off the underside of a bridge that wasn't there. Then something happened that both before and after refused to agree had occurred. My analog second hand continued its path from the 12 to the 6, but the space between those 2 points lengthened without the face widening. The tick became a drawl, a country accent on time, and in the distance where camera B would have stared, the air gained a sheen, not light, not mist, a gloss like clear tape laid over a photograph. In that gloss, shapes moved, not ours, not echoes. A small crowd, shoulder to shoulder, faces blurred the way faces get in low-compression video features, failing to cohere. They stood like they were waiting for an office to open. The whistling stopped. The hum behind the doors deepened a half-step, as if a generator shouldered a load. And a voice, not from Hank, not from me, spoke from the elevator seam. It was a working voice, the polite boredom of a clerk at closing. Account ending in -61 will remit 6. There are sentences that arrive in your life already carrying the weight of 100 previous times they've been said. This was one. It knew its route through the room. The mason's line vibrated. My chest did the same. Somewhere past the gloss, the people shifted, like rain in a stadium. Something slid under my right boot metal, round, the size of a quarter. I looked down and saw a washer ring, oily with age, stamped with a tiny circle on one side. I picked it up without thinking. It was warm, the way a coin is warm when it's been clenched in a hand too long. "Do not take that," Hank said, and because the room has a sense of humor, it waited just long enough to make it unclear whether I heard him before or after I lifted the washer. "Who are you?" I asked the seam. "Who pays? Who owes?" The elevator doors shuddered. A thin line of frost crawled along the seam and evaporated. The gloss at the end of the corridor bulged inward, like a window momentarily bowed under a change in pressure. The metronome ticked faster without being wound, and slammed back to 60 like it had been scolded. "For services rendered," the voice said. "No gender. No impatience. For passage." "Passage where?" Hank's voice cracked on the last word. He's not a man given to cracks. The crowd in the gloss broke, and for an instant the faces filled in. It was a trick of the eye, or mercy. Men in jackets, a woman in a hospital gown, a boy with a baseball tee, a foreman in a hat the plant hadn't required since the 70s. None of them looked frightened. They looked delayed. Something shuffled deeper below. Paper again. Files. A bureaucracy's heartbeat. "Tom Hargrove," I said, and the gloss went matte, like I'd scuffed it with a thumb. A figure stepped out of the crowd and toward the inside of the window from its side. Tom, or Tom being borrowed by something that wore his outline. He pressed his hand against where the glass would be, and my flashlight glared off the contact point with a faint, greasy circle. His mouth moved. The sound crawled through the wrong route in the room before it found us. Friday. He pointed at the analog on my wrist, then tapped his other palm as if stamping a ticket. 6 taps. His eyes lifted high and right toward a point over my shoulder Hank's side of the seam. His mouth moved again, slower. Ledger. Then the corridor did the thing that ruins metaphors for a week. It snapped back. No bang. No flash. The gloss vanished. The metronome reasserted its righteousness. The mason's line straightened. Hank's palm found mine with normal skin meeting normal skin, and we both flinched like we'd touched live wire because normal felt indecently intimate. We staggered back. My digital, the one I hadn't bagged, was off by exactly 6 minutes compared to the analog. Hank's bagged digital matched my analog. The keychain cams, both LEDs steady when we started, now blinked in alternating patterns. One on, one off, like railroad signals warning that 2 trains are going to argue about the same track. We killed the rigs and sat on the floor with our backs to opposite walls, like 2 guys who just talked each other out of a bar fight. My heart slowed. My hands shook. The washer ring sat in my left palm like a dare. What did we just pay? Hank asked. I don't think we did, I said. I think we dodged a bill. He exhaled, and the sound was almost a laugh. You took the coin. It took me, I said, because that's how it felt, absurd as it sounds. Tom said ledger. Hank tapped the bagged digital. We got something the cops can't throw out as panic. 2 synchronized clocks disagree. Video angles will too, if this recorded like last time. We've got proof of an interface, of a toll booth, and a clerk, I added. A voice that knows account numbers. Hank stood on stiff knees and looked down the hallway at the elevator, humble for the first time since I'd known him. What if Ethan didn't fall? He said softly. What if he walked past the window and someone stamped him paid? Then there's a ledger with his name in it, I said. And maybe there's a way to reverse a transaction. A building breathed around us, the old settling sigh of concrete and steel. I pocketed the washer. It nested against my keys and felt heavier than both. I chalked a circle on the wall beside the scorch ring, then drew a short line through it, a poor man's symbol for paid. If the clerk had eyes, I wanted it to know we'd seen the system. If the system could be shamed, I wanted to try. On our way out at the bend, the corridor's light thinned like a cloud passed in front of a moon you couldn't see, and the tuneless whistle played 2 notes and failed to find the third. I didn't turn. Hank didn't either. At the door, as the night air found us, both our phones buzzed. Same number, unknown. Same text, single line. Balance noted. Friday acknowledged. We didn't answer. We drove in separate cars and did not speak on the phone. Sleep is a country with a border, and that night the guards were suspicious. When my eyes finally closed, I dreamed of a counter, a book with carbon copy forms, and a clerk who didn't look up while stamping circles beside names. Each stamp sounded like a metronome tick. Each tick fell slightly behind the last. When I woke, the washer ring lay on my knitstand where I'd left it, leaving a faint oily circle on the wood. The house smelled faintly of wintergreen. By noon, the drives finished copying. The footage from both keychain cams told the truth badly. Frames dropped, then recovered, then lied with conviction. But the audio recorder held steady. The voice was there, clean, bored, and real. Account ending in -61 will remit 6. Hank and I said nothing for a long minute, then both said the same word at once without planning. Ledger. At dusk, the sun threw long lines across my kitchen table. The washer ring sat beside a yellow pad where I'd written names, Tom, Ethan, others from the archive, people who'd vanished near industrial sites with cameras that glitched and clocks that fudged. If a toll was being collected, someone was keeping records. People like that get lazy with routine. People like that make mistakes. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote a plan in block letters, so even fear could read it. Find the ledger. Learn the account numbers. Demand an audit. It felt insane, the way hope feels when it rents a room in a haunted house. But there was one thing better than hope: leverage. Somewhere in that building, a clerk kept books. And in my pocket, warm as a small animal, was proof the counter could be reached. Tomorrow was Saturday. We weren't paying. But next Friday, if there was a door that opened to the ledger room, we were going to walk through it and ask for change. The message sat on my phone like a damp fingerprint. Balance noted. Friday acknowledged. Hank texted nothing for hours, which for him was a kind of scream. At daybreak, he finally sent, "Come by. Bring the ring." The washer lay in my palm, warm as breath, leaving a faint circle on the knitstand like oil that knew my name. I pocketed it and drove through a town that felt an inch to the left of where it should be. Traffic lights changing with a lag. People crossing streets half a step late, as if the whole place had learned to live with a stutter. Hank had coffee and a legal pad and a look that said we'd stopped being men with jobs and become men with errands assigned by something that didn't fill out. W South. Ledger, he said as a greeting. I set the washer on the table. He didn't touch it. If there's a clerk, then there's a system. Systems leave habits. Habits leave handles. He tapped his pen. We need an entry point that isn't the hallway. An intake, not a window. Somewhere the paperwork lives. Basement, I said. The word felt obvious the way shame does. Old buildings bury what they can't discard. Hank pulled a rough map from his files. Lines ghosted by a copier 20 years past retirement. Counterweight rooms here, he said, pointing beneath the elevator shaft. Maintenance access through the west stairwell. Sealed after '03. He slid me a key, ring the weight of a small town. Kept a set, he said, as if confessing to a harmless theft. We didn't go that day. We let Saturday bleed into Sunday and pretended to be citizens. I did laundry. I called my sister to ask about her gout, like I was a man whose weekends had patterns. But the washer ring sat on the counter and made the house smell faintly of wintergreen. And every time the refrigerator cycled, I thought, paper being shuffled, a bureaucracy's breath. By Monday, we had a plan. By Tuesday, we had a list. By Wednesday, I could feel Friday as a pressure in my molars. The cameras were ready. 2 new chest rigs synced to a single time server we kept in airplane mode inside a Faraday pouch until we stepped in. Analog watches wound and set to a radio time signal. Chalk, clean and honest. 2 metronomes, one we'd let free. One we'd clench in a vise to dampen coupling. A barometer, because air ignores magic, but won't lie about pressure. And a carpenter's plumb bob, brass and immodestly certain about down. Thursday evening, an envelope slid under my apartment door. No return address, no markings, just old paper that had drunk a little humidity. Inside, a photocopy of a maintenance report dated March 1998, stamped received twice in sloppy violet. Employee, Hargrove T. incident. 6-minute loss during corridor transit. Fields filled and typewriter faint. Electrical anomaly noted. Someone had written in the margin with a mechanic's dull pencil. Pay window. Below that, 3 chalk symbols I recognized from the bend in the hallway. Triangle, circle, triangle, /6. A greasy ring darkened the lower edge, like someone had pressed a washer there and held it until oil told a secret. Hank denied sending it. I'm not the post office, he said. I'm the idiot who kept a key. We stared at the page until the toner looked like ants. If there's a pay window, I said, then there's a clerk face-to-face sometimes, not just a voice behind a seam. We find where cash changes hands. We find where names change columns. Friday returned with a weather report that lied about rain. We parked 2 blocks away again, so as not to make the building think about us. The night had that warm, cool edge, where breath disappears before you see it, and the factory took its usual bite out of the air as we crossed the property line. Inside, the corridor smelled like damp paper and machine ghosts. We didn't stop at the scorch ring. We took the west stairwell, steps sagging in the middle like tired backs, concrete that had forgotten it was once confident. At the basement landing, our lights found a red stenciled warning half sanded off. Authorized personnel. The rest had been eaten by time and cleaning solvent. The lock on the steel door looked newer than its frame, a small guard on an old gate. Hank tried 3 keys, cursed, then the 4th turned with an exhausted willingness. The door stuck, then sighed, then opened. Air rolled past us, not colder, not warmer, just older. The counterweight room wasn't pretty. A rectangle of concrete and scabbed paint, cables thick as wrists, a catwalk that had no business trusting anyone alive. At the far end, a service desk, a slab of oak, bolted to metal legs, the kind of desk a foreman leans on to tell you your paperwork is wrong. On it sat a punch clock that hadn't punched in years, its face yellowed, its mouth a slot for cards no one fed it anymore. Beside it, a ledger. Not metaphor. Book. Black cover crazed like dried riverbed. We froze without saying freeze. There are moments when talking admits too much. I let the recorder run. Hank lifted the ledger's cover like a man opening a mailbox he expects to contain his own death notice. Inside, pages ruled in blue, indexed with stiff cloth tabs. AF, GM, and Z. Hank flipped to a finger stopped. Hargrove T. The ink wasn't ink so much as a dark that had decided to be letters. Date, March 13th, 1998. Amount, 6. Note, passage complete. Beside it, a circle stamped faint, oily, as if the page had been kissed by a ring. He flipped pages with care. He didn't show his own body. There it was, Lewis, February 17th, 2019. Amount, 6. Note, partial. The word had been underlined casually, the way a clerk underlines when a supervisor is not looking. Partial, Hank said, and the word hurt. Paid, not cleared, I said. The book offered no opinion. Other names, other dates. A quiet city inside the covers. We found blanks too. Entries started and never finished. A date but no name. A note that only read pending. The air thinned. My barometer nudged down, as if weather had decided we were at sea. The plumb bob hung straight, and then described a hair's width oval, like the room had a heartbeat, and the brass could feel it. A count ending in -61, I said to the room. The punch clock hummed, a sound no machine makes when it's truly dead. The desk smelled of wintergreen and old sweat. Paper shuffled somewhere close, not above, not below behind, like the wall had a small office with a window and a man who wore a tie against his will. The voice came the way it had before, indifferent and civil. Present. Hank's hand found my sleeve. His fingers had gone from hands to clamps. We need to make a case, he whispered, as if court's decorum applied. We need to appeal. He wasn't Rome. He just sounded like a man asking a weather system to grant a continuance. I want an audit, I said, each word slower than the last, anchoring syllables to the concrete like tent pegs. Ledger entries for Hargrove, T. and Lewis, E. verification of authorization. Chain of custody for 6-minute remittances. Bureaucracies speak a language. You learn it at Windows, where your birth certificate is the wrong color. The room listened. Paper moved. A single page slid out from beneath the ledger's spine, as if it had been living there to surprise me. It was a copy carbon set, blue, black, and ghostly. The header read, Remittance Dispute Form. The fields made a home for names and times and signatures that would never hold ink. At the bottom, a circle waited to be stamped. Submit at window, the footer said. Fridays only. Where's the window? Hank asked the wall. The wall did not pretend to be a concierge. My light swept the room. On the far side of the counterweight pit, where darkness hid in plain sight, a rectangle of black was blacker, edges too straight to be accident. A panel, flush with the wall, paint a shade nearer to the original than anything else. I crossed the catwalk with the care of a man who doesn't want to give gravity ideas. Up close, the rectangle was a door the color of bad coffee. No handle. A keyhole older than both of us. Hank rubbed his thumb along a rust scar and then tried a key from muscle memory. Number 12. It slid in like it had always lived there. The door opened onto a pocket 2 feet deep, no room, a recess. A glass pane filled it, thick as a bottle and patient as an old courthouse window. A bell sat on the ledge, the kind you ring when the clerk is on break. It wore a hat of dust and a ring of grease at its base. I put my finger on the bell and didn't press. Are we really? Hank began, and then stopped, because the only correct word was doing this. I pressed. The bell didn't ring so much as agree to be rung. The sound went sideways, muffled and exact, and then the pane frosted at the edges like breath had found it from the other side. Behind the glass, light rose, no switch, no bulb, a level of brightness that remembered factories where men worked third shift while their children dreamed of different lives. A silhouette stepped into that light, not ghost, not man, clerk, necktie, shirt sleeves rolled because rules say so, not because heat demands it. The head a blur, the way faces on bad copies blur. He or the idea of he set a book on his side of the ledge and looked at me without eyes. Remittance dispute, I said, and slid the carbon copy into the slot at the bottom of the glass. The paper caught halfway, met resistance, then passed, like a hand takes a bill and checks the watermark by feel. The clerk didn't reach. The paper simply was on his side now. He stamped it. The sound came through clean, a metronome's tick with a paperwork accent. He stamped again, 6 times. He didn't look up. We request audit for entries Hargrove, T and Lewis, E, I said. Hank breathed like a man who'd swum too long. The clerk turned a page in his book. Account ending in -61, he said in that bored, correct voice. Remit 6 according to schedule. Schedule by whose authorization? I asked. Silence. Pages. The impression of fingers that didn't degrade, of habits that had outlived people. The clerk set a second book down, smaller, with tabs worn soft. Authorization signatures, he said. He tilted the book so the light hit the page the way clerks do when they'd rather you read it yourself and go away. Names I knew, names I didn't. Plant managers. Safety officers. A union rep who'd smiled at me once in a photo with his family. At the bottom of one page, a name that turned my mouth dry. H. Walters. Hank didn't swear. He stopped breathing. The signature wasn't his style, but it was his name, printed by someone who decided on his behalf. Date, the 10th of March, 1998. They forged you, I said. He shook his head, not in denial, but like he'd been struck. Or the book forged everyone, he whispered. The clerk waited, the way windows wait. Partial for Lewis, I said. What does partial mean? The clerk's head angled a fraction, interest at last, or the simulation of it. Held in queue, he said. Remittance incomplete. Behind him, shelves that weren't shelves resolved, a depth of files without ends, a hallway of paper, an architecture of decisions. Queue where? I asked. The clerk's hand or the idea of a hand tapped the glass once, and the frost made a circle there, oily and familiar. The circle sat at my eye line. Friday, he said. We're not paying Friday, I said. He didn't disagree. The metronome in my bag ticked, though I'd never said it. The plumb bob hummed an inaudible line, the way brass hums when something old leans on it. "Audit initiated," the clerk said. He slid our form back. A new mark had been added at the bottom. A small triangle, a circle, a triangle, and the 6 slashed through like a price corrected in chalk. Return window when called. The bell rang once without a finger touching it. The frost withdrew. The light flattened. The pane became only glass. We stood in a room that had nothing supernatural left to prove. Hank's shoulders rounded as if a man had laid a ledger across them. "They write our names," he said. "They stamp circles. They cue people like parts." He looked down at Hargrove, tea again. "Tom is in a file cabinet. Ethan is in a line," I said. Lines can be cut. It was bravado. It tasted good anyway. I slid the washer ring from my pocket and held it against the circle the clerk's touch had left. The metal warmed enough to stop being metal for a second. I couldn't name the sensation better than that. The ledger's page nearest my hand wrinkled as if under a small breeze. Not much. Just enough to suggest that metaphors could be bribed. We packed our arrogance and our terror and our evidence, and we left. The building watched us go with more interest than the night air did. On the street, normal sounds tried their best traffic. A couple arguing gently about nothing. A dog making peace with a trash can. "They called us," Hank said finally, hands on the steering wheel like prayer. "Return window when called." He laughed once without humor. "We're waiting on hold." Sleep didn't come for me so much as concede a truce. At 3 a.m., the washer ring clicked against the glass of the water I hadn't finished. I woke sure someone had rung a bell. My phone lit with an unknown number, then went dark, then lit again. I didn't answer. A voicemail appeared with no timestamp. When I played it, the line hissed a little, and then the clerk's civility filled my kitchen like a smell. "Window open," he said. "Friday midnight." The message ended with the softest stamp. 6 beats, not a threat. A schedule. I texted Hank one word. Called. His dots bubbled and stalled and bubbled again. The dance of a man typing and deleting futures. "We go," he sent back. "We bring the book out," he sent, then retracted, then sent again. I stared at the words until they were ink I could not drink. The ledger had been waiting in that room since before we were men. It would not survive the sun. It might not survive being asked. But something in me wanted to carry a clerk's book into morning and watch the world decide whether to look away. By noon, the plan had a name auditor's walk and a single stupid rule. We would step through the window if it opened. If the corridor flexed, we would flex with it. If a clerk set terms, we would counter. If Tom stood behind glass with a hand against a circle, we would put our hands there and count to 6. Somewhere inside an old factory, a little office kept accounts. Men like Tom were not lines in a ledger. They were the reason ledgers exist. On Friday at midnight, we would learn whether the office believed that too. Friday didn't arrive. It circled like a vulture that had memorized our route. By 11:30, the town felt hollowed out and ready. The Jefferson complex stood there with its rusted ribs showing, and the air over the property line had that faint medicinal bite again, wintergreen threaded through cold metal. We parked 2 blocks away and walked in with the quiet of men who know the door will open whether they knock or not. We went straight for the west stairwell, not the corridor. Our lights kept low. Our gear pared down to what mattered in court. 2 cinch chest cams sealed until the mark. Analog watches wound and set. A wind-up metronome. The barometer clipped to my vest. The plumb bob coiled like a sleeping wasp. The washer ring rode in my pocket. A warm coin with its own patience. We didn't talk. The building didn't either. When old places anticipate you, they shut up. At the basement landing, the authorized personnel stenciling looked clearer than last time, as if attention restores paint. The lock yielded to Hank's key like it had been waiting to be relieved of duty. Inside, the counterweight room breathed that paper and oil air, catwalk shadowed, cables humming softly in their sleep. The oak desk sat where it always had, older than our reasons, with the fossil of the punch clock and the ledger that made metaphors blush sitting square at the corner. "Mark," I said, and hit record on the rigs. The metronome started at 60. The barometer's needle flirted with a slight drop. The plumb bob drew a perfect line from my fist to the floor. The ledger opened under Hank's hands like a dog that might bite anybody else. He had tabs now, sticky flags he'd stuck along H and L, and a few other letters we would not say out loud. He turned to Hargrove and set that page gently against the desk's grain. I took out the carbon copy, the dispute form stamped with the clerk's uncaring patience, and slid it into the window recess. The glass pane looked like a dark lake before dawn. The bell waited with a dust hat and a grease halo. "Ready?" I asked. "No," Hank said, "but go." I pressed the bell. Sound thinned, the way a room depressurizes before a storm, and the pane frosted at the edges, the frost crawling inward like someone drawing lace. Light rose behind it from no source meant for human eyes. A silhouette stepped into place, sleeves rolled, tie in the right place, posture that said every day was a day at work. The clerk set his book down without looking at us and stamped something out of view tick. Tick, tick until 6 sounded like a policy. "Remittance dispute," I said. "Audit requested for Hargrove, T. and Lewis E. Account ending in -61, the clerk said, and the voice reached us the way heat reaches skin. Window open. Time allotted. 6. 6 minutes, Hank whispered, and it wasn't awe. It was a man hearing the rules spoken in their native language. "Define partial for entry Lewis," I said. "Define authorization for Hargrove." Pages turned. The clerk's hand or the idea of a hand landed on a smaller book. Partial. Remittance held in queue for receipt validation. Authorization. Countersigned by Management Schedule 3B, Plant Operations. "Name the countersigners," I said. He tilted the book toward the pane, and the glass decided to be generous with legibility. Names scrolled past in neat hand, thickening where pressure had made ink mean it. Plant managers and safety men who'd stopped returning calls long ago. And that stolen signature. Hutch Walters. Same date. Same casual certainty. "That isn't me," Hank said to the pane. "I did not sign. I was on the night floor at 2 a.m. with a broom and a stomach ulcer." The clerk didn't shrug. The glass shrugged for him. "Counterfeit signatures occur at rate acceptable to schedule," he said. "Bureaucracy, distilled. The admission that a broken thing is fine because it breaks within the line." "We contest authorization," I said, my mouth dry. "We request transfer of Hargrove and Lewis out of queue to petitioner custody pending verification. We request the mechanism of remittance." The pane's frost grew thicker where our words hit it, like breath that had started to believe in cold. Pages slid. A metal drawer somewhere we couldn't see rolled and stopped with the satisfying gravity of a file that hasn't moved in 20 years. Behind the clerk, a corridor of shelves leaned into perspective until it lost courage and turned to suggestion. The metronome hiccuped one beat and recovered. The barometer ticked down a hair. "Remittance mechanism," the clerk said. "Passage exchange. Temporal units for transit." "Transit where?" Hank asked. "Transit to what?" "Facility," he said. "Processing." "Processing into what?" The words came out harder than I intended. The glass fogged once as if it had sighed. "Status," the clerk said, and turned a card toward us. A grainy photograph lived on it, one of those bad shot faces, lit like a DMV booth had been left open overnight. Tom stared from the picture not with fear, but with the half-smile of a man who had been told to sit still and decided to obey. Beneath his name, a stamp, active. Below that, a line, department, corridor mate. The floor managed to tilt while the plumb bob continued to insist it didn't. "You're using them," I said. "You're stuffing whatever that is with our dead." "Remitted," the clerk said, polite. "Not dead. You took them on a Friday," Hank said, hands on the sill as if he might warm the glass by wanting it enough. "Under forged names. With authorization no one alive consented to." "Schedule," the clerk said. He stamped the form. Tick. "What's the appeal path?" I asked. "What is the escalation if authorization is fraudulent? What's the rule when wrongful remittance is proven?" To my surprise, no. To my terror, the clerk answered without boredom. The slightest angle of his head, a rearrangement of the light behind him. "Return," he said, "within allotted window. Present receipt. Clear balance." "We don't have a receipt," I said. The clerk placed a card on the other side of the glass, a slender rectangle with no instructions. Only a circle punched near the bottom edge, and a faint grease print that matched the ring in my pocket. He slid it through the slot. It came out warm, as if it had been kept in a hand. "Receipt," he said. "Account minus 61. 6 remitted. Pending audit." The card lay on my palm and made a small island of weight in my body. The washer ring in my pocket got warmer in reply, like a coin answering its sibling. "Window will open," the clerk said. "Midnight." "It is midnight," Hank said. "Midnight where I am," the clerk corrected, with a civility that had edges. The frost on the pane receded a fraction and stopped, like a held breath that had decided to hold longer. I did the stupid brave thing. I put the washer ring against the glass and pressed. The ring found the faint circle the clerk had left, and for a moment the pain wasn't pain. Not air something generous enough to be mistaken for air. My fingertips tingled like I'd laid them on a CRT screen in 1996. The glass accepted the ring, and the ring didn't fall. It hung there, adhered to the circle as if magnets had reinvented themselves in private. "Request entry," I said. The clerk didn't move, and yet the corridor sharpened. The shelves stopped being suggestions and became geometry. The air in the room thinned to mountain levels. The plumb bob drew a small oval, the kind a hark makes. The metronome's tick stretched a little, and then agreed to be tick again. The clerk's hand rose, palm out, not refusal procedure. "Counts," he said. 6, door between cameras. "We know the door," Hank said. His voice had started to sound like the corridor, stretched and then normal again. "Midnight," the clerk repeated, and the bell rang once by itself, a sound like a date stamped into paper. The light flattened. The pain returned to indifference. The washer ring let go and fell into my palm as if it had never considered betrayal. We stood there for a beat too long, then 2, then 6, then a laugh started in Hank's throat and refused to become a laugh. "We have a receipt," he said. "We have a door," I said. We didn't waste the rest of the minutes on bravery. We closed the ledger on Tom's page gently and left the desk the way you leave a sleeping animal you hope stays asleep. Up the stairs, past the corridor that had unlearned distance for us. The building tested our backs with the softest drafts, like a grandma somewhere was sending us out with a sweater we refused to wear. At the bend, the chalk symbols had been added to triangle, circle, triangle, and now a small square beside the slashed 6. Someone had written paid in a neat, indifferent hand. I wiped the word with the heel of my palm until it smeared gray. "Not yet," I said to no one worth addressing. We met again at 11-50-8, faces scrubbed by cold air and intent. We took opposite ends of the corridor, like before, our boots on old dust, our lungs timing themselves without the metronome now. I could hear Hank breathing from 30 yards. I could hear my own heart from inside my teeth. At midnight, where the clerk was, the corridor flexed. Not like a camera trick, not like an optical lie. It flexed the way a good bridge flexes under a heavy truck, a faith move. The air went thin, The scorch ring's absence drank our light. And down at the end, where camera B would stare, the gloss appeared not a window yet, a promise of one. The crowd formed behind it, faces softened by compression, a line of people waiting for a lunch break call. The whistling started and found its third note for once. It sounded like a man arriving home. "Counts," I said, and lifted my left hand. The receipt card lay against my palm. The washer warmed against my other. The bell we couldn't see rang in memory. 1, Hank said. We stepped. 2. The corridor learned us. Depth surrendered its pride. 3. The gloss accepted our reflection and forgot to return it. 4. Tom stepped forward on the other side, a smile he hadn't earned yet trying itself on his mouth. 5. The clerk's hand came up, stamp ready, a civil god. 6. We put our hands against the circle and pushed. The glass wasn't glass. The corridor wasn't corridor. The line wasn't line anymore. It was a point we entered. For a weightless second, the body stopped being an object in a hallway and became a question inside a ledger. Are you remitted or are you returned? We chose. Or the choice chose us. The window gave. The circle opened. On the other side, the clerk said, "Account minus 61." And his stamp hit paper, and the toll booth's light filled everything with the factory's honest brightness. And my feet found a floor that hadn't been on our side in a long time. The first thing that struck me wasn't the light, though it was the clean, principled brightness of a factory at shift change. It was the sound of paper managed well. Not shuffled, not frantic. Paper moved the way ocean breathes. In, out, according to a tide no man names. Under it ran the low electrical thrum of machines that hadn't been built for comfort, only for correctness. The air tasted like old carbon copies and wintergreen shaved thin. The floor had the humility of poured concrete that has held up lives without thanks. This was not hell. This was compliance. We stood in a narrow room with the geometry of an apology. Just wide enough to be a counter, just deep enough to be a hallway, just high enough to let a clerk forget the sky. The window behind us was no longer window. It was a border that remembered being crossed. Ahead, the desk stretched left and right into the kind of vanishing perspective rooms get in nightmares where you're late to a test. But there were no lines of supplicants, only station's duplicate setups repeating with a bureaucrat's comfort. Bell, ledger, punch clock fossil, stamp. Every 20 paces, the furnishings reset like rooms had been copied and pasted down the axis. The clerk stood at ours, sleeves rolled, tie pinned by habit, face refusing to resolve. "Account minus 61, he said, the way train conductors confirm cities. The stamp waited in his hand, circle warm to duty. "Audit," I answered, because language is a handrail. Hank moved up beside me, breathing steady too steady, the kind of calm men manufacture when panic would be accurate. He set both palms flat on the counter like it was an altar, and he decided to be religious for 6 minutes. "Hargrove," he said, and the name entered the room like a worker reporting for a shift he hadn't applied for. The clerk opened the ledger to H, with nothing so human as a glance pages simply obeyed. The entry we'd seen through glass presented itself, darker here. Ink, it wasn't ink, but intention. Date, amount, the small oily circlet of the stamp. Beside note, the word passage had been underlined in a frugal hand. Partial for Lewis wore its casual underline like a scold. "What is corridor maintenance?" I asked. "Define duties." The clerk turned his head a fraction, and somewhere beyond him, something switched rails. "Correction," he said. "Ensuring continuity between views." He didn't say cameras. He didn't have to. My chest tightened. Ensuring continuity between views is what editors do when a scene has a mismatch. It is what a thing would do if it lived in the splice. "Where are they?" Hank asked. Not a howl. "A line on a form." The clerk tapped the counter twice, and a panel in the far wall softened like wax near a candle. The concrete listened to a rule and gave, revealing not a door, but a corridor whose walls were glass only, while they remembered the idea of glass. Beyond them, space like an architect's drafting mistake angles correct, distances treacherous. People moved in it, not quite in step with us, their gaits a beat delayed or advanced, their shadows arriving unpunctual. Tom was there, 10 yards along, clipboard under his arm. Brows knotted in concentration, as if he'd been given a problem with only one right answer and not enough pencil. He checked a hash mark etched in the wall, triangle, circle, triangle, /6, then held a hand against nothing and waited. The air responded, denting the way a mattress acknowledges a body. He nodded once to the dent and made another mark. He didn't look up. "Tom," I called, and my voice took the scenic route to his ear. He lifted his head like a man who's heard his name across a factory and is deciding whether to pretend he didn't. His eyes didn't find me. Not exactly. They found the space we co-occupied wrong. He smiled a fraction, the way a decent man does when he wants to put you at ease and hasn't decided how. He mouthed something. The word arrived in the clerk's room a beat later and a little embarrassed. "Friday." "Q," the clerk said, and slid a tray through the counter window. On it lay 6 round washers, each stamped with that faint greasy circle, each warm enough to be alive if coins lived. "Receipts." "We have one," I said, lifting the card from my pocket. He placed a blank card on the tray beside the washers, then a pencil. The pencil had been sharpened with a knife, not a machine wood shaved in spiral peels. Some clerk had likely pocketed as a habit. "Endorse," he said. "Petitioner." Hank picked up the pencil. His hand shook once, and did as hands do. Obeyed. Hank Walters, printed clean. He added the date. He pressed the washer's circle against the card and left an oily halo there, a borrowed planet. I signed beneath, printing as if a teacher would grade legibility. The clerk stamped the bottom tick and slid the card back. "How do we move them?" I asked. "Out, balance," he said. "Remit." He nodded toward the corridor, toward Tom, and the line of people whose patience had the dignity of routine. "Exchange." He meant time for time, 6 minutes per head. The arithmetic hit like cold water. "That's theft," Hank said, not an argument, just naming. "Schedule," the clerk answered. 1,000 managers haunted that one word. "How many?" I asked, because numbers burn. The clerk didn't turn his ledger. The ledger turned itself. Pages whispered. Columns aligned. As entered, he paused, then in what might have been politeness added, "Within tolerance." "Let me try something," I said, and stepped toward the corridor. The floor under the transition had the give of a threshold. Beyond, the air possessed a thickness just shy of liquid. My metronome ticked against my ribs, imagined or real. Tom looked up again, and this time his gaze landed nearer, as if I'd moved from radio to television in his world. I lifted the receipt card. He lifted his clipboard like we were showing credentials at a fence. "Tom," I said, the name heavier here. "I'm here to bring you home." His mouth shaped no, not refusal warning. He held up the clipboard, and I saw the columns there. Not names but tasks, not times, but remittances owed. Next to each, a circle. Next to the circles, a triangle. At the bottom, a 6. He tapped the 6 with the end of his pencil and shook his head. He pointed past me to the clerk. Then he pointed up, toward the elevator we had not ridden. Then he touched the glass idea wall with his palm and left a faint oily circle there. A ghost stamp against a window that wasn't. "He can't cross," Hank said, voice low. "Not while he's on shift." "Who schedules shifts?" I asked the clerk. "Schedule maintains itself," he said, which is the same as no one answers for this. "Partial," I said. "Lewis." The name carried a younger gravity. "Status?" The clerk placed a smaller ledger on the counter, pages thin as trust. E. Lewis, pending clearance, a line below. Hold reason incomplete remittance. My skin went cold. He didn't pay the full? Q holds partials, the clerk said. Incomplete remain between views. A door opened further down the corridor that was not, and a woman in a hospital gown stepped from one panel of air into another like a file, moving not across a desk, but through it. Her eyes were clear. She carried nothing. She had the posture of the recently patient dignity arranged carefully around its bruises. A man in a hard-hat 70s vintage stepped aside for her with the politeness factories used to insist on. They nodded like neighbors at a chain-link fence. Take me to where partials are held, I said. The clerk didn't move. The wall behind him did another softening. Another corridor offered, this one narrower, lit by the kind of bulbs churches used to buy in bulk. Window time, he said. I checked my analog. We were bad at time here. The hand said we had some left and some spent. Hank gripped my sleeve. We can't open all the doors on the first night, he said. We need to get one thing right. He wasn't wrong. I hated that he wasn't wrong. Ethan first, I said. Then we renegotiate. The clerk listened like a wall listens, fully and without promise. He slid one washer from the tray to the counter's edge, closer to us. Remit, he said again, and I realized he was offering a discount only because there is no such thing as a discount in a place like this. He recognized the receipt card. He recognized the worn ring in my pocket. Accounts, remember accounts. How do we spend it? The word felt stupid here. The clerk tapped the washer to the circle on the counter. The grease mark brightened for an instant, a halo-catching breath, then dimmed. Applied, he said. The corridor brightened in sympathy, and the people shifted one place forward, like a lunch line that had learned grace. Tom didn't move. His pencil hovered at the bottom of his list with a 6 lived. He looked at me and lifted 2 fingers peace sign or 2 more minutes. I couldn't tell. Where's the window for partials? I asked. A narrower corridor waited. If courage were a tool, I would have checked its edge against my thumb and lied about sharpness. We can't split, Hank said. We'll lose each other between views. We lost each other in the hallway and found each other anyway, I said. If Ethan is between, that's where we belong for the next. I checked the watch. The hand didn't volunteer an answer. For the next few heartbeats, Hank set his jaw the way men do when they've accepted being foolish, as long as the foolishness is principled. 2 minutes, he said, and we back to the window. If the clerk closes this pane, I don't know if the glass remembers how to be kind. We stepped into the narrow run. The temperature didn't drop. The idea of temperature moved aside. The walls blurred at shoulder height, like memory when names won't come. Footfalls sounded polite, not echoing so much as acknowledged. Ahead, a series of small recesses opened off the corridor, each just deep enough to hold a person who might be deciding whether they were arriving or leaving. In the third recess, a kid in a hoodie stood exactly like a man trying to be younger stands, hands half in pockets, chin down, eyes up. Ethan. He saw me first the way deer see, a flick of difference in a forest of same. His pupils widened. His mouth did the math, and then forgot numbers in favor of words. Oh man, he said, softly and rehearsed, like he had been saying oh man every 10 breaths for a while now. His voice arrived only a fraction late, and in this place it counted as punctual. We have a receipt, I said, because receipts are talismans here. I showed him the card. He reached like he'd touch it, and stopped like there was glass that memory remembered. It stuck, he said. I kept walking. In the hall, it was longer. Then it was nothing. Then this, he gestured at the recess, the corridor, the whole schedule. They said Friday. We negotiated midnight, I said. They love schedule. He laughed once, the way men laugh when a joke agrees to be true. "Hank?" he asked, craning around me. Hank stepped into the recess beside me, and Ethan's relief made the air warmer. "I thought you were dead," Ethan said. "Then I thought I was." "You're on hold," Hank said. "We're terrible customers." He lifted his analog and then gave up pretending these dials mattered here and looked at me. "Now." I pressed the receipt to the recess's back wall. It found a circle waiting oily, faint, matched to the ring in my pocket like the world had only ever known one size of debt. The card warmed. The grease brightened. The clerk's stamp far away and right here ticked once, as if approving from behind glass. The wall pushed against my palm, not resisting testing. Ethan pressed his hand beside mine without asking. Hank added his. The recess deepened. The corridor narrowed. The air forgot what side it was on. A pressure built under my nails, the old itch of altitude. "Step," I said, not a command, a prayer. We stepped backward no, forward no, through. The recess decided what direction meant for us. The world blinked the way an eye accepts grit and refuses to complain in public. We were back at the clerk's counter, the way a note lands after a bend. Ethan stumbled once, and then found ground that acknowledged him. He sucked a breath like water and swore softly, reverently. The clerk stamped tick then twice more, not 6. "Partial cleared," he said. "Balance holds." "On who?" I asked. The clerk did not answer. Behind him, the corridor that wasn't shifted its weight. Tom looked up again, and God help me winked, not at me, at the clerk's window, at the fact of a window being gamed. He tapped his list's bottom line again, and put his pencil behind his ear, like a man finishing a long shift does. "Tom next," I said. Hank nodded once, not because he doubted, but because he counted. We were at the edge of whatever 6 meant here, and the pain frost had begun its outward retreat. The bell knew things. It would ring when it wanted to. "Request temporary release," I said, formal because formality had teeth. "Hargrove, T-audit pending." The clerk didn't sigh. The room did. He stamped the ledger once more and placed a small, honest thing on the tray. A time card. Tom Hargrove typed, the font of midnights. A row of boxes, a row of punches. One blank at the far right, the kind of emptiness that demands a stamp. "Return," he said. "Friday." "We will," I answered, and hated the verb for being obedient. The pain flattened toward indifference. The light cooled. The bell's metal held a last sympathetic ring and then decided to be metal again. Behind the glass that was now glass, Tom lifted a hand and put it against the circle. We mirrored him. Our oils met through something that didn't believe in oil. His smile was small and exactly right for a man who wasn't free yet, but had seen the form with his name on it move to the top of a stack. The room released us like a book returns a bookmark, with the knowledge it will open again in the same place if allowed. The corridor learned to be a corridor. The scorch ring drank, then stopped drinking. The factory remembered rust. We were on our side. Ethan was with us, grip iron on my shoulder, eyes red and new, laugh trying to learn how to be here again. Outside, the night conceded we existed. Streetlights hummed. Somewhere, a lawn sprinkler talked to itself about arcs. Hank unlocked his car with the grave courtesy of a man letting a priest in ahead of him. "We owe," he said, not to me, to the air, to Friday, to the ledger. "We owe 6? Or we owe an audit," I said. The washer ring cooled in my pocket, then warmed again as if answering a call. I pulled it out and set it on my palm. It left a faint circle of oil, like a promise and a threat inked in a language older than laws. "Next time," I said, and the words were not brave and not foolish. They were accurate. "We bring Tom home." Then we shut their window, or we write our names in their book in ink they can't use. Ethan stared back at the dark plant, the crooked line of roof against a tired sky. "What is it?" he asked. "Not hell," I said. Worse, a place that thinks it's fair. Ethan slept on my couch, like a man who'd returned from a long shift in a factory that didn't exist on paper. He talked twice in his sleep, oh man, both times like a recorder relearning rewind and play. Hank stayed in his truck outside until sunrise, then texted a single checkmark, the kind foremen scrawl when a pallet arrives intact. By noon, we had a plan nobody would approve. Bring Tom out, then make the ledger admit what it is in a language it can't later deny. We spent the afternoon building anchors. 2 more analog watches for redundancy. A wind-up kitchen timer that rang like dinner in 1974. A pair of click counters, the cheap kind ticket takers still trust. New chalk, new tabbed flags for the book, if we got our hands on it, and a thermos of coffee strong enough to remember our names under pressure. The washer ring warmed in my pocket every time I rehearsed the words we'd use, like a dog lifting its head at its own. By dusk, the town slipped into that Midwest hush where people pretend to be inside earlier than they are. We parked the same 2 blocks away and crossed the same property line that had learned our shapes. The Jefferson complex made the same old sound, air squeezing through broken geometry. In the corridor, the scorch ring drank our light politely. The far end waited without blinking. Downstairs, the counterweight room smelled of paper that had been handled with respect and oil that refused to confess where it had been. The ledger sat like a sleeping animal that kept an ear open. Mark, I said, and we went to work like men starting a shift. Rigs on, analog sensed. Timer set to 6 and wound by hand until its spring sang. 1 metronome damped, 1 free. The card stamped and haloed. Ready? The washer in my palm again, warm as breath. The bell needed no invitation tonight. It rang once by itself, the sound of a date that likes you, and the pain frosted at the edges. Light rose without argument. The clerk stepped into his place, sleeves rolled, tie honest, face refusing to resolve under any amount of attention. Account minus 61, he said. Audit in progress, I answered. Temporary release requested for Hargrove, T. remittance contested, authorization fraudulent. Receipt present. He didn't nod, but the ledger did. Pages turned to Hargrove as if escorting a guest. The punch clock on the desk didn't start, but it did remember how, and the memory made a small electrical sound. The clerk set a time card on the tray. Tom Hargrove, typed neat. 1 blank square at the far right, a little square of emptiness, waiting to become policy. Window open, he said. 6. The corridor that wasn't drew breath. Behind the glass, the maintenance run sharpened. Marks on the walls, faint circles where palms had been, triangles and slashed 6s, collected like a foreman's shorthand for keeping reality square. Tom walked past with his clipboard, pencil behind his ear, gaze pinned to work. He felt us the way factories feel weather change, first in his shoulders, then in his eyes. Tom, I called. My voice took its usual scenic route and arrived 1 beat late. He stopped, blinked like a man who'd stepped from fluorescent to sun, and angled toward the pane. Close up, his face was older than the photo on his time card and younger than the story that carried him. He set his palm on the circle in the glass nobody else would have believed in. The grease brightened. I pressed the receipt card there. The washer ring in my other hand warmed until it forgot it was metal. Temporary release, I said to the clerk. Under audit. Balance holds, he said. Procedure leaning on civility. Balance acknowledged, I said. We will clear it in open view. Hank had the click counter ready. He clicked it once and held it up so Tom could see the small number turning. Count with us, he said, voice steady like a man reading the pledge to a flag that had earned it. You step when we step. Tom's mouth shaped the word okay without sound. He tucked the clipboard under his arm and waited with his palm on the circle like a worker at a revolving door. 1, I said, and we stepped, the pain thickening and thinning under our skin like cold finding glass. 2. The metronome hiccuped and recovered. The kitchen timer's spring complained softly behind us. 3. The corridor flexed like a bridge, remembering trucks. 4. The grease halo brightened. A faint frost line drew a circle around our circle. A bureaucracy's kiss. 5. The clerk lifted his stamp, bored because bored is safe. 6. We pulled. The window gave like an honest gate. The pressure bunched under our fingernails and then let go. Tom's hand slid through the circle, not like a ghost's, but like a worker signing a form he'd had enough of reading. He stumbled forward into our air, into the smell of oil and wintergreen and coffee, into the light that believed in fluorescent bulbs. Hank caught his elbow. I caught his shoulder. The clerk stamped tick and the time card's blank square swallowed ink. Tom looked at the ledger the way men look at their own names, carved into wet concrete years later. He made a small noise that could have been a laugh if it hadn't remembered everything first. Friday, he said, out of breath and out of schedule. Always Friday. You're out, Hank told him. Under audit. The pain cooled a degree. The frost remembered how to recede. The clerk didn't move. He didn't have to. The room had learned how to obey him without him being here to receive the credit. Balance holds, he said again, and the punch clock yawned with the idea of time. The kitchen timer on our side ticked with urgency that had manners. 4 minutes left. Maybe less. Maybe 6 measured away we didn't like. We clear it, I said. In open view. Remit, the clerk said. He slid one washer toward the edge, then another, then a third each warm from a hand that hadn't been ours. 6 lay there like loose teeth. Hank looked at me, not for permission, but for companionship. This is theft, he said softly. Same words, different weight. It's accounting, I said, and hated myself for being right. We did the arithmetic out loud, because numbers are less slippery when spoken. 1 washer the corridor had already accepted Ethan. 2 for Tom's temporary release, stamped into that honest blank square. 3 more to clear balance, a phrase that made fairness sound like a shovel. Wait, Tom said, voice new to our air and already tired of it. Wait, the list. He tapped his own chest with his thumb. There's a... He searched for a word big enough to drag across the gap. There's a spare. A float. They keep one for outages. A standing 6. It sits between counts. It isn't assigned. They pull from it when a Friday lands wrong. He pointed into the corridor that wasn't. Behind the second pane. Bottom shelf. Metal tray. Grease paper. 6 rings in a row that don't belong to names. The clerk's head turned a degree, the tiniest admission that something unexpected had entered the room. He did not contradict Tom. Show us, I said. The pain waited without patience, the way glass does when it's being asked to be generous a second time without a written policy. Hank set 3 washers in a neat row on the tray and left them ostentatiously untouched. We'll remit, he said toward the window. With audit. We moved as a body, Hank. Me, Tom toward the far pane that had pretended to be concrete earlier. It softened again, glass remembering its duty. Beyond it, shelves lined a low alcove, parts room by memory, policy closet by practice. The bottom shelf held a tray covered in brown parchment glossy with oil, and on that paper sat 6 rings aligned like a train you would miss if you blinked. Standing 6, Tom said, reverent and disgusted at once. You move these when a schedule goes sick. They're not supposed to be here when anyone with a badge looks. But no one visits unless something's wrong. And nothing's wrong here by definition. He smiled at his own joke, the kind men make when they've been made into an ingredient. Everything's schedule. Under audit, I said, and slid the tray out. It came easy, like no one had argued with it in years. The clerk did not shout. He did not stamp. He watched with the indifference of a machine that trusts its rails. I lifted one ring. It was warm. I pressed it to the tray's corner and left a circle. The paper took the oil with gratitude. Hank held the kitchen timer up like a cop showing a warrant. 2 minutes left, if minutes meant anything here. Apply a float and withdraw 3 remittances, I said. We'll clear balance with the standing 6. Schedule accepts, the clerk said. The ledger turned a page by itself, and a neat note inscribed itself in a hand, neither human nor inhuman. Float applied, hold. The punch clock agreed, its mouth yawning, then closing, stamping nothing, and yet having stamped. We set 3 washers from the float onto the counter circle. The grease halo pulsed, bright and dim, counting what the room counted. Behind the pane, the line moved. Not forward, back. 3 figures stepped out of their places and stood in the wide between, ready for a form no one ever brought them. The clerk stamped tick, 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 and for the first time, the sound had a faint uncertainty, the way a metronome does on a table with a bad wobble. Balance cleared, he said. Then close the account, I said. Hargrove T. The ledger paused. It did not like verbs that ended things. It liked loops. It liked Fridays. But Tom's time card had the right to a last punch. The clerk lifted his stamp. He hovered over the blank square that was no longer blank. He hesitated the way decent men do at funerals when deciding whether to touch the casket. Then he brought the stamp down with the quiet finality of a door that fits its frame. The ink sat perfect. The circle around the notation darkened. At the bottom of Tom's line, a word wrote itself in that precise, patient hand. Returned. The room exhaled through vents we couldn't see. The pane began to flatten toward indifference. The frost drew back like a curtain that had learned to be a wall. The bell almost rang and then changed its mind. The kitchen timer hit 0, and the tone that belonged to casseroles cut clean through a place that didn't serve food. It made the clerk's head tilt a fraction, not in irritation recognition. We're not done, I said, because saying so was the only way to slow the closing. Audit remains open. Authorization fraud remains on record. Pending, the clerk said. He stamped a small receipt and slid it through the slot. A triangle, a circle, a triangle, the 6 slashed not as a price, as a scar. Window at Friday. We were never going to be done tonight, Hank said from my shoulder, voiced the low comfort of men closing a shop. But we changed the book. Tom stood between us with his clipboard under his arm, like a relic rescued from a church, eyes wet and furious and grateful in unequal measures. He looked back into the corridor that wasn't, and raised 2 fingers to his temple in a small salute to the line of people who are not dead and not here. Some of them lifted hands back. The pain could not erase that. We stepped away together. The room released us like a stamp releases paper. The corridor learned to be honest. The scorch ring drank one last time, then went thirsty. The factory remembered how to be a place in a town instead of a town in a place. Upstairs, the hall didn't stretch to please us. It kept its distance like a boundary that had been negotiated in daylight. Outside, the air had that relieved quality neighborhoods get when a fire truck leaves without its siren. Hank leaned against his truck with the posture of a man whose spine had carried a ledger all night and finally handed it back. Tom looked up at a sky he'd not been allowed to clock in for. That voice, he said, every Friday. You learn to love it because it means you'll get to work. You learn to hate it because it means you'll never go home. You're home, I said. Under audit, he said, and laughed in a way that hurt to hear because it had learned to be clean. We packed the gear and stopped pretending caffeine was a plan. Hank pocketed the receipt like a badge. The washer ring cooled in my palm and felt, for a heartbeat, like an ordinary washer that had never learned how to keep books. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. A text. Float reconciliation pending. Friday. I typed back before fear could redact me. Bring your authorizations. The 3 dots never appeared. The night kept its own counsel. At home, Ethan slept without saying, "Oh man." Tom sat at my table with both hands around the thermos, like heat could be persuaded to enter bones. He touched the time card with one finger the way you touch a photo of yourself as a child. "You're going back," he said to me without looking up. "Yeah," I said. "The book isn't done with us." "And you're not done with it," he said. "Not a question." "No," I said. "We've got names to move." And a signature to vacate. I didn't sleep so much as reboot. When morning arrived, it came with a small, honest dawn that made the plant look briefly like a building and not a policy. The ledger would open at midnight. The window would do what windows do. Before that, we had a day to become men again. Pay bills. Return calls. Write down the steps so we didn't lie to ourselves about what was bravery and what was ritual. At noon, the washer ring ticked against the table by itself. No movement, just a sound like memory being stamped. A second later, an envelope slid under my door without footsteps to drag it. Inside, a carbon copy with a single line typed at the top authorization reversal form and 3 fields blank. Tidy, expectant, account, signature Friday. The form lay on my table like a dare. Authorization reversal form. 3 blank fields weighted account. Signature, Friday tidy, expectant, like the clerk had set a dinner table and was curious whether we'd show up with an appetite. The washer ring clicked once against the wood, a small polite knock that meant time was already happening somewhere else. Account was easy, -61. Signature was not. Someone had written Hank's name into their book 27 years ago without asking permission, and the book had believed it, because books prefer belief to work. Friday was a date that kept arriving and somehow never passed. "We'll sign it," Hank said, jaw set. He had Tom's time card in his breast pocket like a medal. "I'll sign the reversal. Then we'll pin the original next to it and make the window reconcile." He paused, then added with a roughness that didn't ask to be admired, "If they need a signature for a schedule, they can have mine on the right piece of paper for once." Ethan watched us from the door, hands restless, hoodie sleeves chewed at the cuffs. He'd been back a day and already learned the posture of men who expect the ground to become a trick at any moment. "What if they want you?" he said. "Like trade." He didn't say the rest. Nobody had to. "They can't take what we don't remit," I said. "That's a rule they taught us." The words tasted brave and were only partially true. Rules hold until they don't, and then they become anecdotes. We prepared like it was a hearing. Copies of everything. Analog watches wound, timer and metronomes. The plumb bob, because gravity is a truth that likes being invited. Fresh chalk. New flags. A Polaroid camera, the last-minute brainwave of a man who trusts paper that spits out its own proof. We added a steel clipboard with springs strong enough to make a lawyer proud. The reversal form went under the clip. The washer ring warmed through the metal like a second pulse. We arrived early and stood outside the Jefferson complex, like defendants trying to look like petitioners. The building received us with the same old medicinal breath. Wintergreen, threaded through machine ghosts. At the corridor, the scorch ring's thirst made the air sizzle faintly at its rim. Downstairs, the counterweight room looked no different and entirely changed, the way kitchens look after the children leave home. Everything in place, nothing the same. The bell rang once without help. The frost traced the pane's edges like lace that had waited behind glass for a century. The light rose inside, not brighter, more certain. The clerk appeared as he always did, sleeves rolled, tie convinced, face refusing to choose an identity. "Account -61, he said. "Audit final action," I answered. The language steadied my hands. "Submission. Authorization reversal." I slid the clipboard into the slot until the springs complained and then relented. The form passed through and landed on his side with a light thwip of good paper. The clerk set a finger on a count wrote, -61 in a hand that made letters behave. He hovered over signature and waited with the politeness of a window that never learned to push. Hank laid his palm flat on the glass where the circle had learned to be. "Name," he said evenly, and printed Hank Walters in the blank that had stolen him. Then he added, under his own, another signature in slow block letters that shook once and then steadied. Not authorized. He dated it. He looked at me. "Witness," he said. I printed my name beneath, steady and legible, the way a man would if he were testifying with pen instead of mouth. The clerk watched the letters form and did not object. He set his stamp over Friday, paused, and lifted his head a fraction. "Schedule," he said. It had the feel of a question, or the closest he could get to one. "Tonight," I said. "Midnight. Here. Open ledger. Open window. Proof in public." I set the Polaroid on the counter, slid a blank through the slot. "You don't do public," I added, softer. "Windows," he said, which passed for humor in this office. Then he stamped tick, and the form's Friday wore ink. The corridor brightened, the way a road does when it decides to let you see the curve. Tom appeared on the other side and took his place near the circle with the casualness of a man who had worked this shift for 27 years and had finally found himself on a day he hadn't scheduled. Ethan stood at my shoulder and breathed like a metronome switched on, steady, defiant. "We're going to show it to you," I said to the clerk. "Your book forged a name. It kept men on a line with counterfeit consent. You'll reverse authorization, and we'll show you how to write returned where remitted shouldn't have been." The words were bigger than my mouth. The room let them be. "Proof," the clerk said. He turned the ledger, not to Hargrove, not to Lewis, but to a page that held columns titled Authorization History. Signatures lived there like pressed leaves, their veins clear, their colors not dead, but transformed. A rule lived here. A signature written is a door, opened until someone with standing shuts it. He tapped an entry with a stamped dark circle. H. Walters, the 10th of March, 1998. Hank's jaw tightened once. Then he did something he had not done in all the days and nights we'd been going into that place. He spoke to the man he had been. "I did not authorize you," he said to the signature. "I was mopping a spill and worrying about paying for a dentist I didn't go to. I did not sign this. You signed it with my name because it was Friday and you were late. Reverse it." The clerk didn't sigh. Paper sighed. He placed our reversal over the history page, aligned it with a practice that had never needed mirrors. He lifted his stamp and brought it down lightly. Once, twice, 6 times. The ink circles aligned. The old circle darkened. The word next to it rewrote itself in that precise patient hand. VOID. Nothing dramatic happened. The ledger didn't burst into flame. The room didn't tilt. The bell didn't cheer. But the temperature changed by a degree in the way bank lobbies do when a vault door is dogged shut. Behind the pane, the line shifted, weight redistributing like men on a scaffold. Tom's shoulders dropped a fraction, the kind of relaxation you don't notice unless you've been holding boxes for someone else's move for too long. "Now the cameras," I said, and set the Polaroid against the glass at a slant that could see both our side and the corridor's edge. "Between views," I said, more to the place than to the clerk. "Let's teach them to testify." I pressed the shutter. The square whirred out and lay there like a white lie. We watched it darken in slow chemistry until the shapes came. The counter, the circle, the faint double of Tom's outline, my hand, Hank's printed reversal on the other side, the clerk's stamp and meter like a moth pinned to the moment. "Receipt," the clerk said, and for the first time his voice had a nearly human timbre. "Caution." He slid a narrow strip of paper through. Return authorization voided. A triangle, a circle, a triangle. The 6 slashed like a scar and then crossed again like stitches. Now the ledger, I said. For everyone you took with counterfeit consent. We can't finish tonight. We can start. I planted sticky flags down the margins names we'd recognized in the small hours. Men and women who had disappeared in hallways that learned to stretch on Fridays. The flags looked ridiculous in a book, like this bright colors in a courthouse. The clerk followed the run with his indifferent gaze and did not flinch. Proof for each, he said, which would have been delaying in any other room. Here it was a rule keeping itself honest. We spent the minutes we had left in an ugly, beautiful rhythm. Name, flag, Polaroid, stamp, a circle darkening, a word rewriting. We didn't call anyone else through. That would be theft or bravery beyond reason. We did what auditors do when they win small. We moved the burden of proof onto the book. Paper thickened with images that refused to be misfiled. The ledger grew heavier with reversal forms than with remittances. The kitchen timer sang its casserole song. The pain began its retreat, frost dissolving back into glass the way a face returns to a window after you've stepped away and left it with only itself. The clerk placed one more item on the tray, a metal stamp head, the circle engraved into its face, handle missing, just the business end of a civil god. Custody, he said. You're giving us your stamp, I said, slow. Schedule, he corrected, which meant, this is how it is for now. We stepped back as the room let us go. The counter forgot our elbows. The ledger lay there with our flags like a book a child has marked for an impatient parent. Tom and Ethan moved with us. Their feet remembered this side, then relearned it. Upstairs, the corridor did not flex. It watched us leave without drinking our light. Outside, the town had the thin, bright air of 2 a.m., the hour when the night is honest about being almost over. We stood under a streetlight that had earned its keep and looked at each other like men do when a story stops being a story and becomes work again. What now? Ethan asked. We come every Friday, I said. With forms, with flags, with pictures. We keep voiding counterfeit consent until the line on the other side looks like a lunch break instead of a shift change. I held up the stamp head. It caught the streetlight and made a small moon on my palm. And we give them a new rule. No circles without witnesses. Tom smiled in a way that had room for sorrow. They're not cruel, he said. They're correct. That's worse. He touched the time card in his pocket. But correct can be negotiated by people who show up on time. We drove home as the eastern horizon began to consider its job. Sleep came like a clerical error that worked in our favor. When I woke, there was an envelope under the door with no footsteps to blame. Inside, a copy of the ledger's authorization page, our flags printed into it like the book had decided to remember color. At the bottom, a line in that patient hand. Audit active, window Fridays, receipt required. I poured coffee and set the metal stamp on my table. It left no grease, only a faint chill that sank into the wood and then agreed to be furniture. The washer ring lay beside it, ordinary as hardware, monstrous as policy. My phone vibrated once with a text from an unknown number. It contained a single word that read like a compromise in a language both sides could live with. Agreed. That afternoon, I drove to a hardware store and bought a small shadow box frame. I mounted the Polaroid inside, along with the stamp head and the first reversal form's carbon copy. I hung it over my desk the way some men hang a degree or a pair of antlers. When the light hit it at 4 p.m., a circle bloomed in the glass exactly where the clerk's would be, then faded. A reminder. A receipt. On Friday nights now, the Jefferson complex isn't abandoned. It's open for business, ours and theirs. We park 2 blocks away so the building doesn't spend energy on our arrival. We carry forms and coffee. We void signatures the book signed with our names. We bring a person through When the balance and the courage line up, we listen for the bell. We count to 6. People ask what the 6 minutes are, where they go, who keeps them, why they're owed. Here is the only answer that keeps its integrity when spoken aloud. The world is a splice, and there is a room that keeps the cut invisible between cameras. On Fridays, the room charges for the illusion. On Fridays, we pay attention instead. If there's a moral, it isn't elegant. It's procedural. Bring witnesses, bring paper, bring time you can afford to spend, and don't let anyone sign your name for you on a Friday. If there's a miracle, it isn't bright. It's a circle of grease answering the warmth of your hand and the feeling, once in a long while, of a stamp striking paper and finding the right word.